everyone, I hope you're all doing well. For today's video, we're going to talk about a wreck that remained beached for an incredible 34 years from 1973 until her removal in early 2007. The ship I'm talking about is the Scandinavian vessel Cherry Venture. She's not a ship that many people know about, but her story is definitely one worth telling. Hello everybody, it's Jamie from Old Shipping Lines, and in today's video, we'll take a look at her full story from her early beginnings, to her dramatic wreck, and finally, to her aftermath. Her story began as the Scania, a 1,600-ton cargo vessel of Scandinavian origin. She was constructed by the shipbuilders Lindholmen's Varv in Gothenburg, Sweden, and completed in 1944. Nearly 3 decades later, in 1973, she came under the ownership of Sea Tankers of Singapore and was renamed Cherry Venture. The wreck of the Cherry Venture occurred during a voyage from Auckland to Brisbane under the command of Captain Selwenu. A combination of fierce storms and the ship's lack of cargo ultimately led to disaster. Buoys in the region recorded waves reaching as high as 40 feet. For hours, the Cherry Venture fought valiantly against the storm, facing directly into the wind but making no progress. At 6:50 a.m., Captain Selwenu issued a Mayday call. The number 9 Squadron of the Royal Australian Air Force, based at Amberley Air Base, responded by dispatching Iroquois rescue helicopters equipped with winches to evacuate the crew. However, winds of 70 kilometers per hour, towering swells, and almost impenetrable cloud cover forced the helicopters to land at Maroochydore, where they waited for the weather to improve. As the situation aboard the Cherry Venture deteriorated and conditions became unbearable, the decision was made to evacuate. But the ferocious seas tore the lifeboats from their mounts, leaving the crew trapped on board. Hours later, after the ship had already been driven ashore, a local pilot was able to use radio contact to guide the Iroquois helicopters through a treacherous low-altitude route one later regarded as one of the most remarkable peacetime flight operations ever undertaken by the Australian Defence Force. The route, previously unfamiliar to RAAF crews, kept the aircraft below the thick cloud cover and used the landscape itself as protection from the violent winds. Thanks to their efforts, all 24 crew members and even 2 pet monkeys were safely airlifted from the Cherry Venture, though the vessel lay too far up the beach to be saved. The unladen ship sat high in the water, which, when combined with the high tides and strong swell, propelled her to a point far enough up the sand that it could not be successfully refloated. Despite attempts that involved dredging the beach, almost immediately after the storm passed, the conversation turned to Salvage. The ship was intact, just stranded. She seemed at first like a straightforward problem. Initial assessments were hopeful. Salvage experts arrived on the scene, planning to refloat the vessel. The idea was simple: patch any holes, pump her out, and pull her back into the water. But the reality of the situation presented a series of insurmountable technical challenges that would ultimately defeat every attempt. The primary problem was her position. The Cherry Venture was not just on the beach, she was high on the beach, settled firmly into the sand. Each high tide surrounded her, but the ocean never had enough power to lift her weight. Furthermore, the action of the waves began to work sand around and under the hull, effectively cementing her in place. She was beached on a dynamic shoreline where sands constantly shifted, making any stable footing for heavy salvage equipment a logistical nightmare. Various salvage companies were contracted over the following years. They employed different methodologies, from trying to dig channels for her to be towed out, to using powerful tugs in coordinated pulls during high tides. However, each attempt met with failure. The financial and logistical hurdles grew with each passing season. The cost of mounting a major salvage operation was enormous, and the likelihood of success diminished as the ship became more entrenched. There were also concerns about the hull's integrity. After being pounded by waves for months and years, the pivotal moment came when the salvors officially abandoned their efforts. The risk of the ship breaking up during a salvage attempt was too great, and the cost was simply no longer justified. The decision was made to leave her. This marked a critical transition for the Cherry Venture. She was no longer a maritime incident awaiting resolution. She was now a local landmark, a part of the coastline. The shift from a vessel to be saved to a wreck to be managed had begun, setting the stage for the next 3 decades of her story. The failure of technology and engineering meant that the ship would now enter the realm of culture and memory, a silent witness to the power of the sea and the passage of time. Her future was no longer in the hands of salvors, but in the hands of the community, the elements, and the very sands that held her captive. This abandonment was not an end, but the start of a new, unexpected chapter, where the wreck would develop a life and significance far beyond her original purpose. With the salvage attempts abandoned, the Cherry Venture began her second life. What was once a maritime casualty slowly transformed into an integral part of the local landscape, as well as culture. For the people of Queensland's Sunshine Coast, the wreck was no longer a problem to be solved. It was a feature of their coastline, a destination. It became known simply as the Cherry Venture, a familiar sight for beachgoers and a curious attraction for tourists. The ship's integration into daily life was gradual but profound. Families would picnic nearby, fishermen would cast their lines from her rusting decks, and generations of teenagers would see her as a rite of passage, a place to explore. The ship was a constant, a rusty sentinel watching over Tiwa Beach. This new status, however, came with significant challenges for local authorities. The Sunshine Coast Council was now responsible for managing a deteriorating ship in a public space. The primary concern was always safety. The structure was unstable, with sharp edges, exposed steel, and hidden holes. As the years passed, the risk of injury to adventurous visitors grew. The council faced a difficult balancing act: how to acknowledge the wreck's popularity and cultural significance while ensuring public safety. They installed warning signs, but the allure of the ship was too strong for many to resist. The wreck was a powerful drawcard for tourism, bringing visitors to a relatively remote beach, but it was a tourism asset that carried inherent liability. The ship's physical appearance underwent a dramatic transformation over those 3 decades. The once proud blue and white hull began to succumb to the relentless elements. The salt air and sun accelerated corrosion, peeling away paint to reveal the reddish-brown rust beneath. The force of the waves, particularly during storms, gradually twisted and broke the superstructure. What was initially an intact ship slowly became a skeleton. Eyewitness accounts from locals who visited her year after year describe this slow-motion demise vividly. They recall how certain sections would be there one summer and gone the next, collapsed into the surf. Her profile changed constantly, a slow dance of decay that was both tragic and fascinating to observe. This period also sparked a broader commentary on the cultural significance of such maritime relics. The Cherry Venture was more than just a wreck. She was a tangible connection to a dramatic event, a piece of living history. She represented a story of human endeavor, technological failure, and the overwhelming power of nature. For many, she was a monument not to disaster, but to persistence. Her long residence on the beach made her a touchstone for the community, a shared reference point that spanned generations. People who had watched her run aground on the news as children were now bringing their own grandchildren to see the remains. This deep emotional connection is what separates a mere shipwreck from a true landmark. However, as the 1990s turned into the 2000s, this romantic view began to be challenged by more pressing practical concerns. The transition from beloved landmark to perceived hazard was slow but inevitable. The growing pressure for removal was fueled by several factors. Safety concerns became more acute as the structure weakened further. Environmental worries also came to the forefront. There were increasing questions about the potential for pollutants, remaining fuel oil, lubricants, or other chemicals to leak from the disintegrating hull into the pristine coastal environment. The wreck was located near the Great Sandy Strait, a sensitive waterway of international ecological importance. The argument was no longer just about an eyesore or a danger to climbers, it was about protecting a valuable ecosystem. The romantic era of the Cherry Venture as a benign relic was coming to an end, replaced by a sober discussion about responsibility, risk, and the long-term management of coastal heritage. The community's relationship with the wreck was about to change once again, moving from acceptance to a difficult consensus that her time on the beach had to end. The debates about the Cherry Venture's future reached a crescendo in the early 2000s. For years, the conversation had simmered, but a combination of intensified safety warnings, environmental regulations, and a shift in public sentiment led to a final decision. The Sunshine Coast Council, after extensive consultation and studies, determined that the wreck must be removed. This was not a decision taken lightly. It was an acknowledgement that the ship's condition had deteriorated to a point where her continued presence posed an unacceptable risk. The landmark that had defined the beach for 35 years was now slated for demolition. The challenge that had defeated Salvage in the 1970s now fell to a new generation of engineers and demolition experts. This would not be a salvage operation. It would be a complex, carefully planned disassembly. The planning required was immense. Unlike a demolition on land, this operation had to contend with a dynamic tidal environment. The engineers couldn't simply bring in heavy machinery. They had to work with the rhythms of the ocean. The primary objective was to cut the ship into manageable sections that could be lifted and transported away. The complexity lay in doing this safely and with minimal environmental impact. Every step had to be meticulously choreographed. Environmental considerations were paramount. Before any cutting could begin, teams had to conduct thorough surveys to identify and remove any potential pollutants trapped within the wreck. Special measures were put in place to contain any spills, protecting the beach and the water from contamination during the delicate process. The logistical operation itself was a feat of modern engineering. It involved bringing heavy equipment onto the beach, including cranes, excavators, and cutting apparatus. The method chosen was a combination of mechanical shears and thermal cutting torches. The teams would work during low tide, carving the ship apart piece by piece. The technical details of the equipment were critical. The cutting tools had to be powerful enough to slice through the thick, aged steel of the hull, yet precise enough to control the collapse of sections. The sections were then lifted onto waiting trucks during a narrow window of opportunity when the tide was out and the beach was firm enough to support the weight. It was a slow, methodical process, a stark contrast to the single dramatic event that had put the ship there. The operation was a battle against time and tide, a race to remove the structure before the ocean could reclaim the worksite. This marked the definitive end of an era on Tiwa Beach. The engineering challenge was not just about removing metal. It was about erasing a piece of local history that had been visible for decades. The teams on the ground were not just demolition crews. They were the agents of a profound change to the coastline. Each section that was lifted away revealed a little more of the natural beach that had been hidden since 1973. The transition from a beach dominated by a shipwreck to a beach returning to its natural state was emotionally charged for many. The physical removal of the Cherry Venture was the closing of a long storied chapter, but it also opened a new one, focused on the aftermath and the legacy that would remain long after the last piece of steel was gone. The final removal operation began in earnest in 2007, a project that would span several months and extend into 2008. The chronology was dictated by the tides and the weather, a constant reminder of the natural forces that had stranded the ship in the first place. The moment when the last significant piece of the wreck was removed was both an engineering triumph and an emotional milestone. For the workers, it was the successful completion of a difficult job. For longtime residents watching from the dunes, it was the erasure of a familiar silhouette that had been part of their lives for 35 years. The physical evidence of the Cherry Venture was gone, leaving behind only scars in the sand that would soon be washed away. The immediate aftermath involved a thorough environmental impact assessment. Teams scoured the area for any remaining debris, from small metal fragments to larger structural elements buried in the sand. The site was rehabilitated, allowing nature to begin reclaiming the space. The goal was to return Tiwa Beach to its natural state, and by all accounts, the operation was successful in this regard. Local and historical perspectives on the ship's legacy, however, were more complex than simply cleaning up a hazard. For many, the empty beach felt strangely barren. The wreck had been a point of reference, a destination, a story. Its removal did not erase the memory. If anything, it solidified the Cherry Venture's place in local folklore. The ship had achieved a kind of immortality precisely because she was gone. People now spoke of her in the past tense, as a legend. The story was no longer about a decaying hulk on the beach. Reflecting on what remains after the physical wreck is gone, we find that the legacy is not in the steel, but in the photographs, the home videos, the stories passed down, and the indelible mark it left on the cultural map. of Queensland's coast. The ship's greatest impact may have been its long, stubborn residence on that beach, a period that created a shared history for an entire region. That brings us to the end of the story of the Cherry Venture, a ship that went from a forgotten cargo vessel to a local legend, and finally to a memory etched into the sands of Tiwa Beach. For over 3 decades, she stood as a silent witness to the power of nature and the passage of time, a reminder that sometimes what begins as a disaster can become a beloved part of a community's identity. Even though she's gone, the Cherry Venture lives on through the photos, the stories, and the people who remember her a symbol of endurance. And that marks the end of a video, my friends. Thank you all so very much for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Now, if you liked what you saw, please consider subscribing to the channel, as that would help out the channel a lot. Now, if you have any thoughts, comments or questions, please leave them in the comment section down below, as I absolutely love reading your comments. And please let me know in the comment section down below as well what ships you would like me to cover in the future. Now be as well sure to check out our social media pages. We are on Twitter, we are on Instagram, and we also recently have a website, oldshippinglines.com, where we have articles of the ships we cover and we have book reviews as well. I think you will enjoy the website very much. Now, with that out of the way, guys, I wish you all a good night or day, wherever you are. Stay safe, stay happy, and we will see each other on the next video. Goodbye, my friends.